The Calavita Massacre. The first involvement Greece had in World War II was its invasion by Italy in 1940. When the invasion was repelled, Nazi Germany would then invade the country, occupying Greece in 1941. Despite the Greek government fleeing the country to Egypt, resistance against Nazi occupation began almost immediately. Although at first this resistance was relatively small scale, by 1942, armed guerrillas, along with British saboteurs, were proving to be a significant thorn in the side of the occupying Nazi forces. In fact, the Greek resistance to Nazis was the longest of any occupied country in World War II, resisting for 219 days until they were occupied. By 1943, organised and strong resistance forces had developed all over Greece. In western Greece in particular, resistance fighters held a strong and fierce presence. In October of 1943, the Greek resistance captured 80 German soldiers in the village of Kapini. In response to this, the German army launched Operation Calavita, in which the 117th Jaeger Division would encircle the town and seek to destroy the resistance fighters in the mountains around Calavita, a village located in the mountains of Achaia in the Peloponnese region. As the Greek resistance fighters refused to release the 80 German prisoners, the 117th Jaeger Division killed the entire male population of Kapini and Pergi. In response to this, 78 of the captured German troops were then executed by the Greek resistance fighters. Meanwhile, the German troops advancing on Calavita would shoot civilians they passed and attack the villages and monasteries they passed along the way. The Wehrmacht would arrive in Calavita on the 9th of December, where they attempted to speak to the leaders of the Greek resistance. However, they discovered that the 78 German soldiers had been killed and that the resistance fighters had fled into the mountains. Many civilians had also fled in anticipation of the German reprisals to come. German commander Ebersberger would urge the civilians and fighters to return to the town, giving his word that they would not be harmed. On December the 13th, 1943, as other units reached Calavita, they would ring the church bells and then round up the entire population of the town, which by now consisted mostly of women and children, as well as innocent civilians. The people were then ordered into the town elementary school and provided with food to last for one day. At this point, the Nazis then removed all males over the age of 14 from the school, forcing the women and young children to remain. These males over 14 were then led to a nearby field named Kapi Rake. While the men were in the field, the German troops looted all the food and valuables from the town, took 2,000 livestock, and then burned the entire town to the ground. The men who stood in the field could see their houses burning down as they were forced to dig their own graves. Following this, the massacre would begin, as the Germans turned their machine guns on the men and boys, slaughtering them all. By the end of the day, 438 men and boys had been killed in this one field. 13 of these men and boys managed to survive as they hid under the dead bodies of their fellow countrymen, as the Nazis administered the coup de grace to those not immediately killed. The field in which this massacre occurred was in the shape of an amphitheatre. Therefore, the women and children in the school were looking down on the site of the massacre and could see their husbands, sons, fathers, and brothers and relatives being murdered. The resistance fighters and civilians hiding in the hills could only helplessly watch on at these events occurring, both the murders of the men and the burning of the school with the women and children inside. Records show that through the entirety of Operation Calavita, 28 villages and towns were razed to the ground, 3 monasteries were destroyed, and 693 civilians were murdered. The head of the German forces, General Karl von La Suisse, had ordered his troops to record the names of all those who had been executed by the Nazis. Following the massacre, locals would now face starvation, as the Germans burned fields behind them and took any food they could find with them. It was also claimed that the dead bodies left behind were robbed of possessions, with fingers being cut off for rings and jewellery. The women and children who managed to escape the school would then face the task of identifying their deceased family members. The few survivors, along with the women and children, would then also have to bury the dead. With so few people and no equipment, this burying process took 7 days to occur, with the majority being buried in shallow graves. Many would have to build the graves of the dead with their bare hands. The women would lose entire families. One lady lost 8 of her children, as well as her husband in the massacre. It would be 4 days before any outside help would come to Kalavryta. Members of the Russian Red Army were the first to arrive. As the Red Army advanced towards Germany in 1944, Nazis fled the country, finally liberating mainland Greece. Some of the Aegean islands would still be occupied until the end of World War II. When World War II was over, there had been 400,000 casualties in Greece. The economy and infrastructure of the country was practically destroyed, and the Jewish community of the country was practically wiped out. Fortunately, this would not be the end of the bloodshed in Greece, as civil war would soon break out, leaving over 100,000 people dead and the country in even further economic ruin. Greece would become extremely politically divided, with a coup d'etat occurring in 1967, in which the country was run by military colonels. While the church in Kalavryta has since been rebuilt, the clock is permanently set at 2:34, which is the time at which the massacre began. There would be little accountability for the perpetrators of the massacre. Karl von der Suisse, who commanded the Wehrmacht's 117th Jaeger Division and had ordered the massacre to be carried out, would die as a prisoner of war in Stalingrad in 1954. Efforts have since been made at some sort of reconciliation regarding the events that took place. The President of Germany visited the town 50 years later to express his grief and shame. There are still, however, many calls for compensation and greater recognition by villagers and many Greeks for the worst massacre in Greece in World War II. Unfortunately, the events that occurred at Kalavryta were not an isolated incident at the hands of the Nazis. For example, the Dystoma massacre in 1944, where the Nazis went door to door killing civilians after a convoy had been attacked. In this case, 228 civilians were killed. The school in which the women and children were forced into has since been turned into a museum to remember the events. While these events are solemnly remembered by the Greeks, in the context of World War II, this event has received much less recognition than it possibly should have done. Unfortunately, as so many atrocities were carried out by the Nazis, massacres such as those that occurred at Lidice and Babi Yar have meant that the Kalavryta massacre has perhaps not received the recognition or even compensation that it deserves. The Massacre of the Acqui Division. In April of 1941, Greece was conquered by the Axis powers of Italy and Germany. The island of Kefalonia, which is one of the Ionian Islands, was held by the Acqui Division of the Italian army, consisting of some 11,500 Italian soldiers. In September of 1943, an armistice was signed between Italy and the Allies. This was approved by the Italian king and the then Italian Prime Minister. The German reaction to this was swift, as Hitler moved to attack the Italian forces and to free Mussolini, who was at the time being held in captivity by the Allies. After this armistice was declared, the commander of the Italian army in Greece, Carlo Vecchiarelli, informed the commander of the Acqui Division, Antonio Gandin, not to attack the Germans unless they were first attacked. Gandin was later informed by the Italian High Command that German troops were to be viewed as hostile. He was given an ultimatum with 3 options which he allowed his troops to decide. The options were 1. To join the Germans, 2. To hand over arms and be repatriated, and 3. To resist against the German forces. His troops voted for option 3 by a large margin, with different and conflicting orders coming in from different positions within the Italian army hierarchy. Perhaps one could say this miscommunication made things a lot worse, with the Italians convinced that the Germans would be hostile no matter whose side they fought on. The negotiations continued until the Germans gave the Italians a deadline of 2 o'clock on the 15th of September to remain fighting on their side. This deadline passed, and in retaliation to this, the Germans sent reinforcements to Kefalonia, attacking and bombing the island. Meanwhile, the Allies offered no help to the Acqui Division for fear that they would soon rejoin the German side. In the eyes of the Nazis, the Acqui division were viewed as deserters and traitors. Initially, the Italians, with help from local Greeks, managed to resist this German attack. However, they were soon overwhelmed by the Nazis' superior numbers and weapons. 300 Germans and 1,300 Italians would be killed. Once the Germans had gained control of Catalonia on the 21st of September, the massacre of the Acqui division began. Any Italian officer who had surrendered was ordered by Hitler to be executed for treason. Those who were executed were killed by machine gun fire by the Gebirgsjäger division, an infantry of mountain troops of the Wehrmacht. Remaining soldiers were marched to the town hall. This is where General Gandin himself was executed, along with a further 137 senior officers. Their bodies were then buried at sea. Remaining Italians were forced to dump these bodies at sea. The rafts these Italians were on were then blown up, adding another 20 Italians to the death toll. Common soldiers were then convicted of treason after the senior officers were killed, with another 5,000 soldiers being murdered. These bodies were again dumped at sea or burned. Those remaining were transported to detention camps. However, around another further 3,000 soldiers died on the way. Most had been killed by mines on their journey. Of the Acqui division, 10,500 soldiers were killed. There was some but little justice for the perpetrators of this after World War II. Only General Hubert Lanz, commander of the Gebirgsjäger division, was sentenced to 12 years in prison for his ordering of the massacre. Perhaps the little attention focused on this massacre at the Nuremberg trials is why the events have become somewhat lost to history. In Italy, this massacre gained little attention. However, the film Captain Corelli's Mandolin, starring Nicolas Cage, did help to spread some awareness regarding these events, with remembrance and acknowledgement starting to increase. The Marzabotto Massacre. Another war crime that does not tend to feature much more in history is the Marzabotto Massacre, which occurred in the village of Marzabotto, located south of Bologna in Italy. Despite being the deadliest mass shooting in the entire history of Italy, the event has often been overshadowed by other horrors of World War II. In fact, it was the worst massacre of civilians carried out by the SS in Western Europe in World War II. The massacre was essentially a reprisal against resistance and partisans, and those believed to be collaborators against the Nazis. Germans, aided by fascists, were pushed back by the Allies in September of 1944 to Monte Sole. Here they encircled Marzabotto and sought to punish all those they believed had helped the rebels. Residents had gathered in churches, homes, shelters, and any space they could find. Here, soldiers, led by Sturmbannführer Walter Raeder, systematically killed hundreds of the residents. The Nazis used bombs, guns, and flamethrowers against the civilians. Women and children were certainly not spared, and any building that could be burned was. While the numbers are not exactly confirmed, at least 770 people were killed, with Raeder reporting the massacre as an execution of 728 bandits. Some sources estimated well over 1,000 people were murdered. 189 of the dead were under the age of 12, 142 were over 60, and 3 were Catholic priests. A priest named Giovanni Fornacini risked his life to protect many innocent civilians, and when he was found attempting to bury the dead, he was in turn executed by the Nazis. As for Raeder, he was arrested by the Americans, passed to the Italians, and tried in 1951, where he was sentenced to life imprisonment until his release in 1985. At a military tribunal, perpetrators were ordered to pay €100 million to the survivors.